The sun hung high in the sky, bathing the Arlington National Memorial in a golden glow. It was a day like any other, with tourists gathering to witness the solemn changing of the guard ceremony, a spectacle of precision, tradition, and unyielding discipline. Among the crowd was a woman named Jessica, her blonde hair catching the light as she stood at the edge of the barrier, eyes fixed on the soldiers in their immaculate uniforms. But something dark simmered beneath her curious gaze, a silent, festering prejudice. Jessica's voice cut through the respectful hush, sharp and grating. "Hey, you big guy," she called out, her words laced with an undertone that many ignored, but one man felt acutely. The big guy in question was Michael Harris, a tall, statuesque figure in the iconic uniform of the old guard. He stood motionless, his expression a mask of discipline as Jessica's words hung in the air. She laughed, a smug sound that carried over the murmurs of the crowd, adding, "You don't really fit the picture, do you?" This is supposed to be a tradition, after all. Michael remained still, his training anchoring him in place. Yet inside, a storm brewed. He had endured these subtle daggers before, the innocent comments that questioned his place, his worth, his right to wear the uniform. Today, however, the weight of her words felt heavier, compounded by the searing heat of the afternoon sun and the watchful eyes of the crowd. Jessica wasn't finished. Emboldened by the lack of response, she leaned closer, her voice dripping with mockery. "A black man guarding this place of honor? Doesn't seem very American to me." The words hit like a slap, but Michael's stoic exterior didn't falter. He had trained for years to master control, to become a living statue when on duty, unyielding in the face of distraction or disrespect. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some tourists turned their heads, pretending not to hear, while others exchanged awkward glances. A few even chuckled nervously, unsure how to react. But Jessica thrived on the discomfort she was creating. It was as though she relished the power her words held over the silent soldier and the complicit audience. What Jessica didn't understand, or perhaps didn't care to, was the depth of Michael's commitment to his role. His position wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a duty he carried with pride despite the challenges. His father, a Vietnam veteran, had instilled in him the values of service and sacrifice. To stand guard here, where so many had given their lives for freedom, was an honor Michael cherished. But moments like this chipped away at that pride, leaving behind a bitter residue. Jessica continued her taunts, her voice growing louder as if daring Michael to react. "Bet you got in because of some quota," she sneered, her laughter echoing in the solemn space. Michael clenched his jaw beneath his immovable mask of calm, his hands tightening ever so slightly on his rifle. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a response, no matter how much her words stung. As the tension mounted, a young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Why is she being so mean, Mom?" His innocent question seemed to hang in the air, a stark contrast to Jessica's venom. The mother shushed him gently, casting a wary glance at the woman who now seemed to revel in the unease she was causing. The heat bore down on Michael, sweat beading on his forehead beneath the brim of his hat. His posture remained flawless, his gaze fixed straight ahead. But inside, he was wrestling with a familiar demon, the gnawing doubt planted by people like Jessica, who couldn't see past the color of his skin to the dedication and discipline that defined him. Jessica's taunts began to attract more attention. A few members of the crowd stepped back, muttering amongst themselves. Others stared openly, their expressions ranging from discomfort to quiet anger. But no one stepped forward. No one told her to stop. It was easier to look away, to pretend this wasn't happening. Despite the inner turmoil, Michael held his ground. He thought of his training, of the countless hours spent mastering the art of stillness and restraint. But more than that, he thought of the men and women who had stood here before him, some who had faced far worse than taunts. They had endured, and so would he. But Jessica wasn't done. She moved closer to the barrier, her tone shifting from mockery to something darker. "You'll crack eventually," she hissed, her words a challenge as much as an insult. "People like you always do." The venom in her voice sent a chill down the spine of those within earshot. A few tourists began to murmur amongst themselves, their unease growing. And yet, Michael remained still, his silence speaking louder than any words could. It was a defiance that Jessica didn't understand, a quiet strength born of years of hardship and resilience. But as the sun beat down and her words continued to cut, a question began to form in the minds of those watching. How much could one man take? As Jessica's taunts escalated, so did the tension in the crowd. What would happen if her words turned into something more? And how long could Michael maintain his composure under the weight of her relentless attack? Stick around as the story takes a dramatic turn, exposing the true cost of unchecked prejudice. The air around the Arlington National Memorial grew heavier, not from the summer heat, but from the charged atmosphere that Jessica had created. The crowd was no longer just a collection of tourists marveling at the ceremonial guard. They had become spectators to a new, uncomfortable drama, one that many weren't sure how to navigate. Jessica, emboldened by the inaction around her, decided to push further. "You know, you really don't belong here," she said, her voice carrying a mocking lilt. "This is a place of tradition, of honor. People like you don't represent that." Her words cut through the reverent silence, echoing off the polished marble monuments. The crowd stirred uneasily, with a few people shaking their heads in disapproval, but doing little else. Michael, standing at his post, felt the weight of every syllable. This wasn't the first time he had been the target of such prejudice, but the public nature of this humiliation made it harder to bear. He wanted to tell himself that the insults didn't matter, that they couldn't touch the integrity he carried within him. Yet, the sharpness of her words was undeniable. Each one felt like a chisel, trying to carve away at the dignity he had spent years building. Jessica noticed the murmurs of discomfort in the crowd, but misinterpreted them as encouragement. She raised her voice, ensuring that no one could ignore her. "Look at him," she said, gesturing toward Michael, standing there, pretending to be all noble. "But what do you really know about sacrifice? About tradition?" Her words were calculated, aimed to provoke. Some members of the crowd exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and dismay. A few whispered to each other, questioning whether they should intervene, but most remained silent, their discomfort immobilizing them. Jessica, sensing no immediate opposition, pressed on. "You see, this is the problem," she continued, her voice growing louder. "They let just anyone wear that uniform these days. No standards anymore. It's all about politics." She spat the last word like it was a curse, her disdain evident. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but his training held him steady. He thought of his instructors, their relentless drills, their constant emphasis on composure. He had been taught to endure to withstand any distraction, any provocation. Yet, standing there, exposed to Jessica's ridicule, he couldn't ignore the sting of her words. The crowd, though still hesitant to act, began to shift. A woman in her late 40s leaned over to her husband, whispering, "This isn't right. Someone should say something." He nodded but remained rooted in place, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Nearby, a group of teenagers exchanged uneasy glances, their phones clutched tightly as if debating whether to film the scene unfolding before them. Jessica's voice cut through again. "You probably got this job because they needed to fill a quota," she said, smirking. "That's how it works, right? It's not about merit anymore." She turned to the crowd, addressing them now. "Am I wrong? Doesn't this seem a little out of place to you all?" The reaction was mixed. A few people looked away, their discomfort evident. Others avoided eye contact entirely, their expressions unreadable. But there were some scattered among the group who nodded subtly, their agreement with Jessica's sentiment unspoken but clear. Michael caught sight of those nods from the corner of his eye, and his chest tightened. He had always known that prejudice lingered in the shadows, but seeing it emerge so openly, so shamelessly, was a painful reminder of the uphill battle he faced every day. Yet, he refused to let it break him. Jessica, noticing the lack of outright opposition, felt empowered. She took a step closer to the barrier, her eyes narrowing. "You're a joke," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Standing there, acting all proud. "But what have you really done? What have you really earned?" At that moment, a security officer appeared, weaving his way through the crowd. He approached Jessica cautiously, his demeanor calm but firm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," he said, his voice steady. "This is a solemn ceremony, and your behavior is disruptive." Jessica turned to him, her expression indignant. "Disruptive? I'm just exercising my right to free speech," she said, crossing her arms. "Is that a crime now?" The officer held his ground, repeating his request for her to move back. After a tense moment, Jessica relented, muttering under her breath as she stepped away. But the reprieve was short-lived. As soon as the officer moved on, Jessica returned to her previous spot, her demeanor unchanged. This time, she leaned over the barrier, her voice low but sharp. "You can't hide forever," she hissed at Michael. "People like me will always see through the charade." Michael felt his composure wavering. The heat, the crowd, the unrelenting barrage of insults, it was all beginning to take its toll. He thought of his family, of the sacrifices they had made, of the pride they felt when he donned his uniform. He thought of his father's words, "You carry more than just a rifle, son. You carry history." And yet, here he was, standing in the crosshairs of someone who refused to see him as anything more than a target for her hatred. It wasn't just about him anymore. Jessica's words were an attack on everything he represented, on the legacy of those who had come before him. The crowd's unease continued to grow. Some whispered among themselves, questioning why no one was stepping in. Others began to film, their phones capturing Jessica's tirade and Michael's unflinching silence. But the question lingered, how much longer could he endure this? Just when it seemed like things couldn't escalate further, Jessica crossed a line no one expected. Her actions would push Michael to a breaking point and leave the crowd stunned. What happens when the restraint of a disciplined soldier meets the unrelenting hostility of prejudice? Stay with us as the tension reaches its breaking point in an unforgettable confrontation. The air was thick with anticipation, an unspoken tension that gripped the crowd like an invisible hand. Jessica, relentless in her campaign of humiliation, leaned closer to the barrier, her every move a calculated provocation. She reveled in the power she thought she wielded, the ability to strip away someone's dignity with nothing more than words. But she had no idea just how close she was to unleashing something far beyond her control. Michael stood firm, his training a lifeline in the chaos. He had been taught to endure, to become a pillar of unshakable resolve in the face of any distraction. But this moment felt different. Jessica wasn't just a distraction. She was a storm, hurling insult after insult with a cruelty that was almost surgical. And the crowd, though uneasy, remained frozen, their silence complicit. Jessica's smirk grew as she stepped closer to the barrier, her eyes locked on Michael. "What's the matter, big guy?" she sneered. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you just don't have anything smart to say." The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing louder. Some turned to leave, unwilling to witness what they feared was about to unfold. But most stayed, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. And then, she crossed the line. Frustrated by Michael's unyielding silence, Jessica did something no one expected. She climbed over the barrier, her movements quick and deliberate. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she landed on the sacred ground where the guards performed their solemn duty. For a moment, it was as though time itself had stopped. The crowd held its collective breath, their disbelief palpable. Michael's heart pounded as he registered what was happening. This wasn't just an insult anymore. It was a blatant violation of everything he stood for. His hands gripped his rifle tighter, his body tensing as he prepared for what might come next. Jessica, emboldened by her bold move, took a step closer to him, her expression triumphant. "Look at you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, standing there like a statue. "What's the point? You're nothing but a puppet in a uniform." And then, without warning, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sound echoed like a gunshot, sharp and jarring. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps and shouts, their shock rippling through the memorial. Phones shot up as people scrambled to record the moment, their disbelief evident in their wide eyes and hushed voices. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Michael's face remained turned from the force of the slap, his body motionless as he processed what had just happened. But then, something shifted. Michael turned back to face Jessica, his movements deliberate and controlled. His eyes, usually calm and focused, now burned with a fire that was impossible to ignore. He took a step forward, his towering presence suddenly imposing. "Step back," he said, his voice steady but commanding. The words were simple, but their weight was undeniable. Jessica faltered, her bravado slipping for the first time. She glanced around, realizing that the crowd was no longer silent. Whispers of disapproval and murmurs of support from Michael began to rise. Still, she stood her ground, unwilling to back down. "What are you going to do?" she taunted, her voice less confident now. "Hit me? That would be career suicide, wouldn't it?" Michael didn't answer. Instead, he acted. With the precision of a trained professional, he moved to restrain Jessica, his actions swift but measured. He grabbed her arm, firmly but without unnecessary force, and guided her back toward the barrier. "You violated sacred ground," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Step back now, or I will remove you myself." Jessica struggled against his grip, her indignation turning to rage. "Let go of me," she shouted, her voice shrill. But Michael's grip remained steady, his control unshaken despite the chaos around him. The crowd watched, their phones capturing every second of the confrontation. Some cheered him on, their voices rising in support. Others remained silent, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. As Michael guided Jessica back toward the barrier, a security officer rushed to intervene. He placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, signaling for him to release her. Michael complied immediately, stepping back into his rigid stance as the officer took over. Jessica, now in the officer's custody, continued to shout and struggle, her outrage unabated. The crowd, no longer silent, erupted into conversation. Some criticized Jessica's actions, calling her behavior unacceptable and disrespectful. Others expressed admiration for Michael's restraint, marveling at his ability to maintain his composure in such a volatile situation. But not everyone was on his side. A small but vocal group began to argue that his reaction was unnecessary, claiming that Jessica's actions, while inappropriate, didn't warrant such a response. As the officer led Jessica away, her voice carried over the crowd. "This isn't over," she shouted, her words laced with venom. "You'll regret this." Michael stood motionless, his face an unreadable mask. But inside, he felt a mixture of relief and unease. The situation had been diffused, but the consequences of his actions loomed large. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations a mix of support and criticism. Some approached Michael, offering quiet words of encouragement. Others walked away, shaking their heads. But one thing was clear: this moment would not be forgotten. The videos captured by bystanders would ensure that the incident would live on, sparking debates and discussions far beyond the boundaries of the memorial. As Michael stood at his post, his mind raced. He thought of his family, of the values they had instilled in him. He thought of his fellow guards, of the legacy they carried together. And he thought of Jessica, of the hatred that had driven her actions. He knew this was only the beginning. The repercussions of this moment would ripple outward, touching every aspect of his life. With the immediate crisis diffused, the fallout begins. Michael's actions will be scrutinized, his character questioned, and his place in the guard threatened. But amidst the chaos, an unexpected ally will emerge, forcing everyone to reevaluate what truly matters. Don't miss what happens next as the story takes an even deeper turn as the dust settled over the chaotic scene. The once solemn atmosphere of the memorial remained charged with tension. Michael returned to his post, his expression unreadable as he resumed his stance, rifle in hand, eyes fixed ahead. But the moment of confrontation had left its mark, rippling through the crowd and setting off a chain reaction of emotions and opinions. The tourists, no longer passive observers, divided into factions. The first group, visibly uncomfortable, began to filter out of the memorial. They avoided eye contact, their hushed whispers betraying their unease. "I can't believe she slapped him," one woman murmured as she ushered her children away. What is she thinking?" Her husband nodded silently, his hand gripping her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. But not everyone shared her sentiment. A second group lingered near the barrier, their expressions hard and their voices sharp. "That guard overreacted," a man in a baseball cap said, his arms crossed defiantly. "She was out of line, sure, but he didn't have to grab her like that." His companion, a woman holding her phone, chimed in, "It's on camera now. We'll see what the authorities think about his so-called professionalism." Meanwhile, a third group began to voice their support for Michael. A young woman holding a toddler close to her chest spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. "That woman humiliated him for no reason," she said, addressing the man in the baseball cap. "He showed more restraint than anyone else would have. She crossed the line, not him." The debate swirled around the memorial, a cacophony of conflicting views that echoed across the sacred grounds. Michael, standing tall and silent, absorbed every word. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. But he held his composure, his disciplined stance masking the turmoil within. Amidst the crowd's division, a new figure emerged, Captain Richard Hall, Michael's direct supervisor. Hall was a man of imposing stature, his uniform crisp and his demeanor authoritative. As he approached the scene, the crowd parted to let him through, their voices dropping the murmurs. All eyes were on him now, waiting to see how he would respond. Hall scanned the crowd before turning his attention to Michael. His gaze was stern, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Harris," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, "step forward." Michael obeyed, his movements precise as he stepped out of formation. He stood at attention, his eyes fixed ahead as Hall began his assessment. "I've been informed of the incident," Hall continued, his tone clipped, "and I've reviewed the footage captured by security cameras. While I understand the provocation you faced, your actions violated protocol." The words hit Michael like a blow. He had known there would be consequences, but hearing them spoken aloud felt like a betrayal. "Sir," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. The individual in question breached the barrier and initiated physical contact. My response was in accordance with— Hall held up a hand, cutting him off. "Your response was inappropriate for the circumstances," he said firmly. "You are hereby suspended pending an investigation into your conduct." The crowd erupted into chaos. Supporters of Michael protested loudly, their voices clashing with those who sided with Jessica. "This is ridiculous," a man shouted. "He was just doing his job." Another voice countered, "He went too far. This isn't the military I want to see." Michael stood motionless, his jaw tight as Hall's words sank in. The suspension wasn't just a professional setback. It was a blow to his sense of identity, his purpose. He had dedicated years of his life to this role, enduring countless challenges to uphold the values he believed in. And now those values were being called into question. As Hall turned to address the crowd, his voice rose above the din. "This matter will be handled internally. I ask that you respect the process and allow us to conduct a thorough investigation." But his words did little to quell the tension. The crowd continued to buzz with speculation, their opinions more divided than ever. Amidst the turmoil, Michael felt a wave of frustration and despair. He had faced prejudice before, but this was different. This wasn't just about Jessica's actions. It was about the system's inability or unwillingness to stand by him in the face of injustice. He thought of his father, of the sacrifices their family had made for a country that still struggled to see them as equals. The weight of that history pressed heavily on his shoulders. And yet, even in the face of this setback, Michael refused to give in to bitterness. He had always believed that resilience was his greatest strength. If the system wouldn't support him, he would find a way to rise above it. But for now, he had to endure the fallout, to navigate the storm that Jessica's actions had unleashed. As Michael turned to leave, escorted by another officer, the crowd began to disperse. But the division lingered, a stark reminder of the deeper issues at play. Some left with anger, others with sadness, and still others with a sense of vindication. But one thing was clear. The incident had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. As Michael grapples with the consequences of his actions, an unexpected connection forms with a young boy caught in the crossfire. Danny's presence will challenge Michael's perspective and force him to confront the deeper meaning of duty, integrity, and redemption. Stay with us as the story takes a surprising turn that no one saw coming. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the memorial grounds, Michael walked away from his post, his suspension hanging over him like a cloud. Each step felt heavier than the last, his boots hitting the pavement with a weight that wasn't just physical. The crowd behind him had mostly dispersed, but the murmurs of their judgment still echoed in his ears. He wondered if anyone truly understood what had just unfolded or what it meant. But as he rounded a corner near the visitor's center, a small voice called out, halting him in his tracks. "Excuse me, sir." It was hesitant, almost timid, but it carried a note of sincerity that cut through Michael's inner storm. He turned to see a young boy, no older than 10, standing a few feet away. His sandy blonde hair was tousled, his blue eyes wide with uncertainty. Michael recognized him instantly. This was Danny, Jessica's nephew, the boy who had stood silently by her side during the entire ordeal, his presence overshadowed by her loud, hateful words. Michael's first instinct was to keep walking, to avoid any further entanglements with the family that had brought his day crashing down. But something in Danny's expression stopped him, a mixture of fear, shame, and an unspoken plea. "What do you need, kid?" Michael asked, his voice even but guarded. He crouched slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. Though his towering presence still seemed to intimidate Danny, the boy fidgeted, his hands twisting the hem of his t-shirt. For a moment, it seemed like he might bolt, but then he spoke again, his words tumbling out in a rush. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Danny stammered. About what happened? My aunt. She shouldn't have said those things. And I shouldn't have." He stopped abruptly, his face flushing red. Michael's brow furrowed. "Shouldn't have what?" he asked, his tone softening just enough to coax the boy into continuing. Danny hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. I threw some peanuts at you earlier," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "When she told me to. I didn't want to, but she said it was just a joke. I didn't know it was going to get so bad." His eyes filled with tears, and he looked up at Michael, his small frame trembling. "I'm really sorry." For a moment, Michael didn't know how to respond. He had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, to navigate challenges with discipline and composure. But this was different. The boy's apology was raw, unfiltered, a rare glimpse of vulnerability that cut through Michael's frustration and anger. Michael sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Listen, Danny," he said, his voice steady but kind. "What your aunt did today, it wasn't right. And it's not your fault. You understand that?" The boy nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "But throwing peanuts at someone," Michael continued, "that's not okay, either. It might seem like a joke, but things like that can hurt more than you realize. Not just physically," He tapped his chest lightly over his heart. "But here, too," Danny sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "I know," he said. "I didn't want to do it. I didn't want her to get mad at me." His voice cracked, and Michael could hear the weight of the boy's fear, not just of his aunt's anger, but of the larger situation unfolding around him. Michael studied Danny for a long moment. The boy's sincerity was clear, and his remorse struck a chord. He thought of his own childhood, of the moments when he had felt powerless against forces he couldn't control. He remembered the older kids at school who had teased him for his father's military service, for the way his uniformed family stood out in their working-class neighborhood. And he remembered his father's unwavering patience, the way he had always turned those moments into lessons. "Come here," Michael said, gesturing for Danny to step closer. The boy hesitated, but eventually closed the gap between them. Michael placed a firm but gentle hand on Danny's shoulder. "What matters now is what you do next," he said. "You can't change what happened today, but you can decide the kind of person you want to be going forward. Do you understand?" Danny nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. "I want to be better," he said softly. "I don't want to be like her." Michael's heart ached at the boy's words, but he nodded, his expression resolute. "Then you've already taken the first step," he said. "It takes courage to admit when you've done something wrong. That's the beginning of change." As they stood there, a small but unexpected bond began to form between the soldier and the boy. Michael saw in Danny a chance to break the cycle, to plant a seed of understanding that might grow into something greater. And Danny, for the first time that day, felt like someone was truly listening to him. But their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices in the distance. Michael turned to see a security officer escorting Jessica back toward the parking lot. She was livid, her face flushed with anger as she berated the officer. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "I didn't do anything wrong. He's the one who should be in trouble." Danny flinched at the sound of her voice, his small frame tensing. Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on the boy. "Listen to me, Danny," he said firmly. "You don't have to be like her. You can choose your own path, no matter what anyone else says or does. Do you hear me?" Danny nodded again, his resolve growing stronger. "I hear you," he said, his voice steadier now. Michael straightened, his hand still on Danny's shoulder, as he watched Jessica disappear into the distance. He knew this moment wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all you needed. As Michael and Danny's unlikely connection grows, they find themselves face to face with Jessica once more. This time, the confrontation reveals a shocking truth about her behavior and gives Danny the chance to stand up for what's right. Stay with us as the story reaches a powerful turning point you won't want to miss. The tension hung thick in the air as Michael and Danny approached the parking lot, where Jessica's voice could be heard long before she came into view. She was in a full tirade, her shrill tone cutting through the late afternoon calm like nails on a chalkboard. Tourists gave her a wide berth, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disdain. But Jessica seemed oblivious, her focus entirely on berating the security officer who had escorted her off the grounds. Michael felt Danny stiffen beside him. The boy's earlier resolve was being tested by the sheer force of his aunt's rage. "Stay close," Michael said quietly, his hand lightly resting on Danny's shoulder. The boy nodded, his small frame trembling but determined to stay by Michael's side. Jessica spotted them before they reached her. Her eyes narrowed and a sneer curled across her lips. Well, she said, her voice dripping with venom. "If it isn't the star of the show, come to gloat. Have you?" Her gaze shifted to Danny, and her expression hardened. "And you?" she snapped. "Where have you been? Running off with him like some kind of traitor?" Danny flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, he looked up at Michael, drawing strength from the soldier's steady presence. Michael stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Danny, his posture calm but unyielding. "Enough, Jessica," he said, his voice firm. "You've caused enough damage for one day." Jessica scoffed, crossing her arms. Damage? Don't make me laugh. You're the one who assaulted me in front of everyone, and now you've brainwashed my nephew. What's next turning him against his own family? Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. No one's turning him against anyone, he said evenly. Danny's a good kid. He deserves better than to be dragged into your hate. The words hit their mark. Jessica's face flushed with anger, her hands balling into fists at her sides. How dare you, she hissed. You don't know anything about me or my family. You think you're so high and mighty, standing there in your uniform. But you're just a pawn, nothing more than a tool for a system that doesn't care about you. Michael took a deep breath, letting her words roll off him like water. This isn't about me, he said. It's about you and the choices you've made today. The way you've treated me, the way you've treated Danny, it's not right. And deep down, I think you know that. For a brief moment, something flickered in Jessica's eyes out, perhaps, or recognition. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a sneer. Don't try to psychoanalyze me, she snapped. You're not better than me. You're nothing. Before Michael could respond, Danny stepped forward. His small voice cut through the tension like a bell. Stop it, Aunt Jessica, he said, his tone trembling but resolute. Just stop. Jessica's head whipped around, her eyes narrowing at the boy. Excuse me? She said, her voice dripping with incredulity. Danny swallowed hard, but didn't back down. You're wrong, he said, his voice gaining strength. What you did today, it wasn't okay. You embarrassed yourself, and you embarrassed me. Michael didn't do anything to deserve what you said to him, and I'm not going to stand here and let you keep acting like this. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica stared at Danny, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort. The boy's words had struck a nerve, cutting through her bluster in a way that even Michael's calm reason hadn't. Around them, a few lingering tourists stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. You don't know what you're talking about, Jessica said finally, her voice wavering. You're just a kid. I'm not a kid, Danny shot back. I'm your nephew, and I'm telling you the truth, even if you don't want to hear it. Michael watched the exchange with quiet pride. Danny's courage was a rare thing, especially for someone so young. He could see the boy's hands trembling at his sides, but his voice didn't falter. This was a turning point, not just for Danny, but for everyone watching. Jessica looked around, realizing for the first time that she was no longer in control of the narrative. The eyes of the crowd were on her, their judgment plain. Some recorded the moment with their phones, ensuring that her behavior and Danny's bravery would live on far beyond this parking lot. Her face crumpled, and she turned away, muttering under her breath. This isn't over, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier venom. She stormed off toward her car, her movements stiff and jerky. The security officer followed at a distance, ensuring she didn't cause any further disruption. When she was out of sight, Danny let out a shaky breath. Michael crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You did good, Danny, he said, his voice low and steady. You stood up for what's right. That's not easy, especially with someone you care about. Danny nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I just couldn't let her keep doing that, he said. It's not who I want to be. Michael smiled, his pride evident. And it's not who you are, he said. You're stronger than you think, Danny. Don't forget that. The boy nodded again, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Some approached Michael, offering quiet words of support and gratitude. Others patted Danny on the back, their admiration for the boy's courage clear. As Jessica faces the consequences of her actions, the story takes a final turn that brings closure for Michael and a brighter future for Danny. But how will the system respond to Michael's suspension? And what lessons will Danny carry forward from this pivotal day? Don't miss the resolution of this powerful and emotional journey. The days following the incident at the Arlington National Memorial were a whirlwind of emotions and consequences. Videos of the confrontation had gone viral, sparking heated debates across social media and news outlets. Some decried Jessica's actions, condemning her blatant disrespect and racism. Others focused on Michael's response, debating whether his restraint had been appropriate or excessive. But amidst the public uproar, one thing became clear. This was a story that demanded resolution. Michael spent his suspension in quiet reflection. Though he had always been a man of principle, the events of that day had shaken him. It wasn't just Jessica's words or actions that lingered in his mind. It was the crowd's reaction, the division among them, and the realization that even in the face of blatant racism, justice wasn't guaranteed. But Michael wasn't alone in his journey. Danny, the young boy who had shown such courage in standing up to his aunt, had become an unexpected source of hope. The day after the incident, Danny's parents, Jessica's estranged brother and sister-in-law, reached out to Michael. They had seen the footage and were horrified by Jessica's behavior. More importantly, they wanted to thank Michael for the kindness and guidance he had shown their son. "Danny's been talking about you nonstop," his father said during a phone call. "He says you're the kind of person he wants to be when he grows up. I don't think I've ever seen him so inspired." Michael was deeply moved. Despite everything, this was the silver lining he hadn't expected, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was room for growth and connection. He agreed to meet Danny and his family for lunch, hoping to offer the boy further encouragement. When they met, Danny was brimming with questions about Michael's career, his training, and what it meant to serve as a guard at the memorial. Michael answered each one with patience and honesty, weaving in lessons about integrity, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The boy soaked up every word, his admiration for Michael evident. "I want to do something about what happened," Danny said, his voice steady despite his young age. "I want people to know that what my aunt did was wrong." Michael smiled, his pride in the boy growing. "You already did something, Danny," he said. "You stood up to her. That's not easy to do, especially with someone in your family. But if you want to do more, there are ways to make a difference. It starts with treating people with respect and kindness, no matter who they are." Danny nodded, his determination clear. Michael could see the boy's potential, a spark of hope that reminded him why he had taken on this role in the first place. Meanwhile, Jessica faced the fallout of her actions. The footage of her tirade and physical assault on Michael had reached authorities, and she was charged with disorderly conduct and public harassment. Though she initially denied wrongdoing, the overwhelming evidence left little room for defense. She was fined and ordered to attend sensitivity training as part of her sentence, a small but meaningful step toward accountability. Back at the Arlington National Memorial, Captain Hall called Michael in for a meeting. The investigation into the incident had concluded, and Hall's demeanor was markedly different from the day of the suspension. There was no mistaking the respect in his tone as he addressed Michael. "Harris," Hall began, "I owe you an apology. After reviewing all the evidence, it's clear that you acted with remarkable restraint under incredibly challenging circumstances. The system didn't support you the way it should have, and for that, I take full responsibility." Michael listened silently, his expression calm but thoughtful. Hall continued, "Your actions reflected not only your training but also your character. You represented this institution and this country with honor. It's men like you who remind us of the values we strive to uphold." With that, Hall reinstated Michael to his position, adding a commendation for his professionalism and courage. The reinstatement was more than just a return to duty. It was a recognition of the quiet strength that Michael had demonstrated, even in the face of injustice. The resolution of the incident brought a sense of closure, but it also sparked a broader conversation. The memorial staff implemented new guidelines to address harassment and provide better support for their guards. Training sessions were introduced to help staff and visitors understand the importance of respect and inclusion, ensuring that such incidents would not be tolerated in the future. As for Danny, the boy continued to stay in touch with Michael. Their bond grew stronger with each passing month, and Michael became a mentor of sorts, offering guidance and encouragement as Danny navigated the challenges of growing up. The boy's newfound confidence inspired his classmates and even prompted his school to start a campaign promoting kindness and understanding. The events of that day became a turning point for everyone involved. For Jessica, it was a wake-up call, a chance to confront the prejudice that had shaped her actions and begin the difficult work of change. For Michael, it was a reaffirmation of his values and a reminder that resilience and integrity could prevail, even in the face of adversity. And for Danny, it was the beginning of a journey toward becoming the kind of person who could stand up for what was right, no matter the odds. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this remind us of the power of courage, kindness, and standing up against prejudice. And there's more to come. Check out our other videos for more inspiring tales that will challenge your perspective and warm your heart. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.